Hi guys, well today's session's on the biological approach. So what does the spec say that you need to know? You need to know the basic assumptions of the biological approach, including the influence of genes, biological structures and neurochemistry on behaviour, genotypes and phenotypes, genetic basis of behaviour, evolution and behaviour. This is on pages 112 and 113 of your course textbook. So, what is the biological approach? The biological approach combines psychology and biology to provide a physiological explanation for human behaviour. It tries to explain how we think and feel and behave in terms of physical factors within the body. So, in basic terms, it's our biology that causes our behaviour. What are the basic assumptions of the biological approach? Basically, everything psychological is at first, at some point, biological. The approach investigates biological structures and processes within the body and how that impacts on behaviour. It suggests that our behaviour is caused in several different ways. I use the mnemonic BINGE to help me remember. First, biochemical. Biochemical changes in the body can alter people's behaviour. For example, low levels of serotonin in the brain are often associated with depression. High levels of serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter by the way, are also often associated with severe anxiety. Sometimes infection can cause diseases such as syphilis. Syphilis is known to cause psychosis, and influenza in pregnant women is also linked to schizophrenia in their children. Neuroanatomy. Now, this is the parts of your brain. So any changes in the brain structure, for example, having to have parts of the brain removed, maybe you've got a tumour or brain damage, can often change a person's behaviour or personality. Now, some of you who did GCSE might have heard of Phineas Gage, who had a pole through his head. This pole, when once was removed, he managed to survive, altered his personality, and he went from being a kind of calm person to a very aggressive person. Genetics. Twin studies, so that is identical twins. That means that they have got the same genes, okay, the same DNA, suggests that schizophrenia and some other disorders have a genetic component. And lastly, evolution. Darwin came up with the idea of devolution, and we'll look a bit more at that later on. And he suggested that of the theory of natural selection, that the way we are and the way we look is all to do with how to adapt to our environment and survive in our environment. So, for example, did you know that women wear red lipstick? Because when a woman is fertile, so they can reproduce, their lips go naturally redder. So women wear red lipstick to trick men into thinking they are fertile. Overall, the biological approach believes that the mind lives in the brain. This compares differently to the cognitive approach, who believes that the mind is separate to the brain itself. So let's look at the genetic basis of behaviour. Psychologists are interested in trying to determine and provide evidence for the extent to which behaviours or a characteristic such as intelligence is the product of our genes or the product of our environmental influences. Now, can you think of an approach that says it's really just the environment? We've done both of them already. It's behaviourism and social learning theory. They believe that it's all about the environment in comparison to the biological approach, who thinks it's really just about your biology. So, how do we investigate genetic basis of behaviour? There are different methods for investigating the extent to which psychological characteristics are affected by inheritance from our parents and evolution, and also the evolutionary genetic basis of behaviour. First off, we've got twin studies, family studies, adoption studies, and selective breeding. So let's look at twin studies first. Psychologists are interested in studying twins in order to investigate the genetic basis of behaviour. Let's check that we understand the difference between the different types of twins that you can get. First off, we've got monozygotic twins. These twins are formed when a fertilised egg splits in two and forms two separate embryos This is what we call identical twins, so they look the same. So it would be 2 boys or 2 girls. Then you've got dizygotic twins. This is when 2 separate eggs are fertilized at the same time in the womb, and 2 babies grow together and you get 2 separate placentas. These are non-identical twins. So this is when you get twins who are a boy and a girl. It can be a girl and a boy and a boy, but they are not identical. So that's the key difference. Their DNA is not the same. Whereas monozygotic twins, their DNA is the same. Concordance rates, this refers to the extent to which a pair of twins are similar in their traits or characteristics. I.e., there should be 100% concordant rates between monozygotic twins if a particular characteristic is a genetic one, because obviously they've got the same genes. Dizygotic twins will show lower rates because they're just like any normal brother or sister and sister. Their genes aren't the same. We also make comparisons that be made between twins raised together and twins raised apart. Family studies. In 1869, Francis Galton suggested all natural abilities are inherited. This is a simplistic view. Galton later had to agree that any resemblance between family relatives could be the result of both genes and a shared environment. However, with alcoholism, for example, there is a suggestion of a biological predisposition to addiction. Adoption studies. These studies involve comparing a trait or characteristics between adopted children and their biological or adoptive parents. So, for example, if a child has been adopted and they develop depression, we would look to see whether the adoptive parents have had depression and whether the biological parents have had depression, and see whether there was any similarities. This would help us understand whether it was the environment or the genetics. Selective breeding. This method involves artificially selecting male and female animals for a particular trait. These animals are then put together in order to breed and produce offspring. If the offspring has the trait that was desired, for example, being very placid, then you could suggest that meant that the trait was genetic. Selective breeding has also been used to demonstrate how a number of behavioural characteristics may have a genetic basis. For example, maze-bright rats. These are basically rats who find it really easy to find their way around them. Let's look at genotype and phenotype. The basic units of inheritance are called genes. Genes function in pairs, and the recombination of genes from our parents to their offspring provides the basis for genetic variability. What is a genotype? They are the genetic makeup of a person, the actual set of genes an individual has and is made up of. This is your genotype. However, they only determine the potential for our characteristics. Phenotype. The observable characteristics of an individual are called your phenotype. They depend on the interaction between your genes, your genotype, and environmental factors. An individual's anatomical features or observed traits such as behavioural and physical characteristics, shape, metabolic rate, activities that you like doing, your size, your hair colour, etc., fall under your phenotype. What's the difference between a genotype and a phenotype? The genotype is the genetic programming that provides the phenotype. To a large extent, an individual's phenotype is determined by its genotype. However, genes are only part of the equation. The genotype often interacts with the environment to make its phenotype. Hair is a good example. An individual's genes determine whether or not they have hair on their head, but how long that hair is and remains depends on environmental factors such as excess sunlight, chemicals used on the head, or a poor diet. This shows that phenotype is influenced by the environment. Twins. Identical twins are another good example of the interaction between inheritance, genotype, and the environment. They have the same genetic makeup and they look alike, but they often possess different phenotypes. identical twins have differences that allow those who are close to them to tell them apart. Also, their fingerprints are different. Twins are genetically the same. Any differences you may see between them, for example personality, taste, aptitude, are due to differences in their experiences or environment. Let's have a closer look at recessive and dominant genes. A gene can be recessive or dominant. A recessive gene only shows if the individual has 2 copies of the recessive gene. For example, the gene for blue eyes is recessive. You need 2 copies of the gene to have blue eyes. A dominant gene, however, always shows even if the individual only has 1 copy of the gene. For example, the gene for brown eyes is dominant. You only need 1 copy of the gene to have brown eyes, and 2 copies will still give you brown eyes. So, the phenotype is blue eyes, and the genotype is 2 little bees. And for brown eyes, the phenotype is obviously brown eyes, but the genotype can be 2 different things. It can be a brown gene and a little blue gene, or 2 brown genes. So the genotype is actually quite different in both cases. So, in summary, the genotype is something you cannot see with your eyes. Examples are dominant, recessive, and heterozygous genes. Phenotype are the things that can be seen with your eyes. For example, eye colour, how high you are, how length of your hair, your weight. Evolution and behaviour. Evolution is the changes in inherited characteristics in a biological population over successive generations. Charles Darwin emphasised 2 main concepts of the evolutionary theory: natural selection and sexual selection. Natural selection. Animals with particular traits that provide them with an advantage are more likely to survive and reproduce, thereby passing on their adaptive traits to their offspring. Those who adapt to their environment will reproduce, and those who do not will die out. Sexual selection. This is based on the principle that we all want our genes to be passed on to future generations. We therefore will adapt our behaviour to ensure we get a mate to be able to reproduce. Those with characteristics that are desirable will reproduce more often, and their features and behaviours will be passed on. Let's evaluate the biological approach. Strengths of the approach. The biological approach is very based in scientific methodology. It suggests that we can find causes and effects and relationships of both physiology and behaviour. Scientific approach lends credence to the study of psychology and helps to establish psychology as a respectable science. It also uses a lot of very objective scientific methods that study behaviour. For example, cognitive neuroscience uses PET scans, EEGs, MRIs, and the use of all this complex machinery allows accurate and precise measurements, and its conclusions are therefore based on reliable data. Also, real-life application. Having a better understanding of the biochemical process in the brain has led to the development of drugs that can treat mental illnesses such as depression and schizophrenia. Although they don't work for everyone, it has enabled some sufferers to manage their condition and live relatively normal lives. Limitations of the approach. It has a causal conclusion. The biological approach assumes that some mental disorders are caused by the action or inaction of neurotransmitters on the brain. They make this assumption based on the fact that drugs that they have given them reduce the symptoms of the mental disorder. This is a limitation because it's claiming causes where only association exists. Basically, they're saying, for example, if you have a headache and you have a paracetamol and the headache goes away, the headache is caused by the lack of paracetamol, which we all know isn't the case. So we don't know if the actual cause of depression, for example, is a low level of serotonin, or whether it's just the body's reaction to the drug that they're given. It's also a deterministic approach. It believes that we are determined by our physiological, genetic, or evolutionary makeup, basically stating that if our parents had depression, we will get depression. If our parents are aggressive, we will become aggressive. It's saying there's no free will over how we behave. Imagine if we found a gene for criminal behaviour. Think about all the criminals who would suddenly not have a criminal record and be put in prison, but put in a psychiatric ward. Also, it cannot separate nature and nurture. The biological approach ignores the role of the environment, and what we should really be doing is to be using the biological and the environment in combination, which we call the biosocial approach. For your homework, you are going to be having to answer the question, discuss the biological approach in psychology, and refer to at least one other approach in your answer. I'll be going through how to do this in the lesson.